Um, all right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Gripprich, and I'm the Special Projects Administrator for TAASA. I welcome you to our workshop. I'll give Dixie and Leila an opportunity to introduce themselves in just a moment. But before we get started, I just wanted to go over some of the housekeeping rules and give you some more information. This is our annual conference, our second time we're doing it virtual. We appreciate any and all patience as we navigate through a new platform and the joys and pains of what it means to be online. You would think that a year and a half would make us all experts at doing things online, but as many Zoom meetings as I'm on, I forget everything that I'm doing every single time. Just so you know, the session is being recorded. If you prefer not to be shown, feel free to turn your cameras off at any time. And you can do this by clicking the camera icon at the bottom left-hand corner of your Zoom screen. Please mute yourself again unless you are speaking. This will greatly help us minimize any kind of background noise. And I also just want to make a general reminder that all the sessions are approximately an hour and a half long with about a 30-minute transition break between workshops. And that allows you time to kind of stretch your legs, check on any young people who are doing remote learning, grab yourself a snack, kick your fur babies out of your space because they're making a lot of noise, which is always my problem. Because if one is not barking at a leaf, the other one is snoring very loudly at my feet. So they have all been kicked out of my space right now. But if you hear any noise, I apologize for that. Again, the pains and joys of working from home. So access to all of our recorded workshops are going to be made available on the TAASA conference page by next week, and will stay up until September 30th. And then we're also going to keep an eye out on the chat box, and we'll be sharing some links to our workshop survey, all those good things, and I'll make sure you guys get that. CEU credits will be available 2 weeks after the conference, so August 9th-ish for those who indicated that they needed it during registration. You might want to just check your email inbox for messages from our training coordinator, Crystal Garcia. And if you have any questions during or after the conference, please feel free to email us at conference@taasa.org, and we'll get you taken care of. Just some content warning, as with any workshops, we just want to let you guys know that our sessions will discuss topics that are potentially triggering, we know that. And if at any time you feel the need to speak with an advocate, please send a private message to me, and I will make sure that we connect you with someone as soon as possible. So with that, I am going to turn this over to my two amazing, brilliant co-hosts and co-presenters, Leila Wood and Dixie Hairston, and let them introduce themselves and introduce our workshop. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it.
Good morning. My name is Leila Wood, and I'm Associate Professor and Director of Evaluation at the University of Texas Medical Branch Center for Violence Prevention. We're here today to talk about campus-based advocacy services for survivors of sexual and dating violence, and specifically talking about trauma-informed and social justice-informed implementation and evaluation. I'm going to let Dixie introduce herself, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what we're going to do today. I just want to say that this is the first of a two-part session today, so we'll kind of go over what's going to happen in each session.
Hi, my name's Dixie Hairston. My pronouns are she and her and hers. I am the Senior Research Coordinator at UTMB, UT Medical Branch Center for Violence Prevention. I work on primarily our evaluation of campus-based advocacy services at the center, and I also work on another evaluation that we're doing of a hotline. So my primary area of focus is emerging adults, so the population of 18 to 25 that have experienced violence. I'm happy to be here today and looking forward to it.
And Once again, I'm Rick Gripprich. For those of y'all that just joined us, I am the Special Projects Administrator for TAASA and also the Campus Sexual Assault Specialist. So a lot of my work is really focused on working on high-level projects and external partnerships that TAASA has created or established, one of them being UTMB and working with Leila and Dixie. I also do a lot of Title IX work across the state, mostly working with colleges and universities on ensuring that their response is meeting the needs of survivors, that access to services is being implemented and met, and also doing some training with faculty and staff, and then understanding, the things that students are going through and helping campuses just be better because their students deserve better. So if you have any questions or need assistance with any of the campuses that you're working with, please feel free to reach out. Our contact info will be at the end of the presentation.
So to just kind of lay the groundwork, this team of people, along with Dr. Rachel Bostrag at University of Texas, Arlington, Dr. Cynthia Jones at University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, and then our colleagues at the Texas Council on Family Violence, Brielle Backus, Roy Rios, just to name a few, have been working for the last 3 years together on a series of community-based evaluations looking at services for survivors on college campuses. So what you're going to see today is going to kind of mirror that long-term collaboration. We're going to do a lot of back and forth, presenting on things together. We've been working on this together for a long time. We have a campus advocacy toolkit, the 1.0 version that we have available via web. We'll be updating it this year, so we'll be talking a little bit about that, but we do have some materials based on what we're presenting today. I just wanted to say that, take breaks as you need them. We were talking as we were planning for this. I know a lot of folks on this session are in the field doing work with survivors, and we're hearing over and over again how busy this summer has been for you all. And with the COVID surges and some of the other kind of pressing issues that are happening around the state and the country, we know you're working really hard and that survivors have a lot of needs right now. So take breaks as you need to, have your camera on or off. Know that we'll be monitoring the chat, but it's totally fine this is a bigger group than we expected.
Yeah, totally.
So, you may want to make sure you can totally chime in via voice, but you may want to chat as well. We're excited to get your feedback, your perspective, your insights. If I could just have a quick roll call in the chat of, if people could chime in if they are working with either their position is at a college campus or they're working with survivors who are attending either community college or a four-year college. That would be awesome, just so we have a sense of who's in the group. If we go to the next slide, I want to kind of just give an overview of what we're going to do today. So this is a two-part presentation. So we're going to be kind of laying the foundation today in our first session, talking about campus-based advocacy. And one of the things that we're going to start by talking about is just the context of trauma and interpersonal violence among emerging adults. Then we're going to be talking about different institutional service response, including policy, really talking about the college campus context, and really zeroing in on advocacy, talking about advocacy strategies, how it's adapted for college campuses, and really talking about the ways that we implement these services for this emerging adult population with trauma exposure. In session 2, we're digging in even deeper to talk really in detail about these trauma-informed social justice-oriented skills that are used with campus advocacy, with some application, with a lot of discussion. So that's a little bit of an overview. And Rick, there is a pretty hefty lunch break in between session 1 and session 2, correct?
Yes, there is. So, yeah, so there's a good break in between. Just remember that if you want to come back to this session, just use whatever link that you have to rejoin.
And I'm loving seeing folks from all over the state and from Virgin Islands and places all over the country who are working with collegiate survivors. So welcome. I'm so excited to have you here today. So feel free to chat in with any questions. We'll be monitoring. I'm really excited to have all of you here. And so we're going to just dig into session one. I'm going to turn it over to Rick, and we'll go to the next slide.
So I know I am preaching to the choir when it comes to understanding and talking about trauma, but we just kind of wanted to give a bit of a 101 and try to understand kind of the variances and all of the things that you know, a student or a client is bringing with them. We know that trauma is the sum total of all of the psychological and physical and behavioral and cognitive reactions that are experienced by either an individual or a community in response to an unexpected event or a series of events that overwhelms you, right? We know that trauma is palpable. We know that trauma sometimes is not recognized immediately. We know that folks who have been through something very traumatic may not know that what they are experiencing is what we would call trauma. And so those different variances are all the things that we have to take into consideration. And I want you to think about it from your perspective. I think it's important for us to also remember that every single one of us carries some form of trauma. And especially those of us that do this work. I live and work here in San Antonio, even though I work for TAASA. I'm based in San Antonio. And prior to working at TAASA, I worked at the Rape Crisis Center. And I have been doing this for 21 years. And for that amount of time, I never realized how much all of this work had really affected me. It's ironic because at the same time, all of the trauma that I saw, all of the survivors that I worked with helped inform how I do my work now. But looking back over the past couple of years, it's been a really hard struggle for me to kind of embrace all of those things that I've learned. And I'm starting to see the effects and what that's doing in my life. So I want to validate and honor and recognize for all of the advocates in the room, for all of us that are working specifically with survivors, that your trauma is real. What you're experiencing and what you hear every day is real. And there is hope, there is help, and there is a path to healing as well. And we know that trauma is this emotional response to things, right? So sexual assault is being one of them. And we know also that it's defined by, and it's very unique to each person. And it's also influenced by cultural, historical, social context, and all of our experiences. And what we also know is that it can be produced by one single event, or it can be this ongoing kind of feeling of negative emotions, right? And I think for us, that's what it is for those of us that have been in this work for a very long time, you know, it's these constant things that we're facing every single day. So as much as you recognize your own trauma, it's understanding that trauma, of course, that students bring with them and all of the things that happened to them when they were younger as well. Okay, go ahead, Dixie. So the neurobiology of trauma, for those who aren't neurobiologists, which is this guy, a really great way of understanding and looking at this is that when something traumatic happens to us, our brain kicks in and our body does things. And sometimes we have a choice, sometimes we don't. Sometimes our body says, nope, this is how I'm going to react. Sometimes our brain says, yep, this is what you're going to do. And so to kind of think of it from a very simple perspective, right? When the doing brain alerts us that there is some form of danger, the thinking brain is designed to check things out. And that's how the response comes in. So we all know about fight, flight, and freeze, and we know that the effects of those types of trauma on people, or those types of reactions that people have. And we also know the feelings that each one of those can produce. And the irony is that if you look at fight and flight, there's almost a sense of empowerment behind that, like you did something right? Because all of the training that I had, or I did what people told me, or my brain went into survival mode and this is what I did, right? But then you get that one little aspect freeze. And that one is extremely, I think, a hard approach for a lot of people to understand and recognize, specifically for those of us who maybe not recognize the trauma that another person went through. We will never understand why someone just chose to just lay there, someone chose to just let this happen to them, or they couldn't have a response. But for a lot of survivors, that is very real. And in my experience in working with survivors, I heard that all the time. And the guilt and the shame and all of those things that are associated with it are things that us as advocates have to validate, but also redirect sometimes and let them know that how they responded is perfectly okay. Their reaction was a normal response to an abnormal situation. So go to the next one. So it's also understanding how our brains are wired. I saw this quote and it kind of resonated with me, and so I kind of use it a lot. But it's understanding that our brains are wired for connections, right? When we're traumatized or when we experience some sort of trauma, our brain rewires it for protection, right? Or trauma rewires our brain for protection. So our brain is constantly in this mode of survival and trying to protect us and alerting us that there's some form of danger. And really the ultimate goal or I guess, or response is this guy in this picture right here. So I'm hoping that you get the pun, but it really is all about staying alive. That's exactly what our brain does. Our brain is designed to protect us, to connect us to things, to other people, and it's also designed to keep us alive. All of those functions that we take for granted every day, all of the things that we don't recognize that our brain and our body are doing so that we can breathe and eat and live and experience and emote and feel and do all the things. Go ahead. So when we think about it from a child's perspective, it's important for us to understand what type of experiences young people, specifically 0 through 17, we're going to talk about that population for a second. And I know there's a lot of you out there who do some amazing work around ACEs. And so this is just a very kind of a basic understanding of it, but looking at the effects that childhood trauma can have on a person who's transitioning into adulthood, right? How do those things affect you? How do those things affect your judgment? How do they affect your health? How do they affect how you relate to other people? And do some adults kind of relate their present day interactions or mental illness or substance abuse problems or any other factors that they have in their life? Do they relate those or tie those back to the things that they experienced as a child? And so for those of us that have done this work for a while, we can say yes, because we know that when a child experiences something in their childhood, it has an effect, right? If there is not any kind of intervention that's done or redirection or some sort of therapy or counseling that's done, it can have those adverse effects into adulthood. We know that adverse childhood experiences are linked to, again, chronic health problems, mental illness, substance abuse problems in adulthood, and they can also impact, your ability to go to school every day, right? To function at your job, and it can also impact your earning potential. I am a single child. I am an only child from a single parent, and I grew up very quickly. And I'm also a childhood survivor of domestic violence. And so I'm very fortunate in the sense that, my mother left a situation with really no choice. I mean, she did what she had to do. And I look at that constantly and I think, how did that decision that she made for me as a child, right, for us, how did that affect how I live my life every day? How did it affect how I relate to my family? How does it affect how I relate to other people? And mostly, how do I relate to the women in my life, right? And it gave me a sense of understanding the importance that all of the women in my life have played, from cousins to grandma to aunts to everyone, right? And I look at them as very strong women who've kind of helped shape who I am. That was a good childhood experience for me, but that violence that we experienced also had an effect on me because I try very hard not to be that person. And so it affects a lot of my daily. And so I urge you and encourage you to look back at your own adverse childhood experiences and how has that affected who you are today. Again, we also know that the ACEs have been linked to risky health behaviors, chronic health conditions, low life potential, and early death too. Go ahead. So we also know that adverse childhood experiences, the effect that has on folks, they are 15 times more likely to attempt suicide, 4 times more likely to become an alcoholic, 4 times more likely to develop an STD or an STI, 3 times more likely to use antidepressants, 3 times more likely to be absent from work, 3 times more likely to experience depression, 2.5 times more likely to smoke, 2 times more likely to develop chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, 2 times more likely to have a serious financial problem. The ironic thing is that looking at this, some of you may think, because I look at this and I'm like, yep, I do that. Yep, I do that. Yep, that's affected me. And it scares a lot of people to think, oh my God, what happened to me in my childhood that I have all of these problems, right? Not necessarily, but it's important to understand that they are linked to adverse childhood experiences. Go ahead. So what kind of trauma are students dealing with? Well, they're dealing with a lot. Physical or sexual abuse, some sort of abandonment or neglect, some sort of betrayal of trust, and specifically from a primary caregiver. I think it's important for us to recognize, and I know that every one of you who works with survivors understands this, is in the process of COVID-19 kind of taking over our lives and our livelihoods and the way we live and changing our old normal to a new normal, and this idea of protection and keeping us safe from this horrible virus, what it inadvertently did was it also put young kids and young adults at risk because kids are staying home. A lot of times they're staying home with their primary caregiver, who is their abuser. Adults have more access to kids who would go to school for safety reasons because that was the only place they got a hot meal. That was the only place they got attention. That was the only place that they felt loved and accepted. Now are having to stay home where they are experiencing all of these things. So what Leila said earlier about understanding that COVID has had an impact on us because we're seeing more people than we ever did, we're busier than we ever were, it's a direct correlation to a lot of these experiences that young folks are experiencing at home. So you can kind of read through this. I won't go through all of it, but I do want you to remember that if you work with youth or if you work with young adults in any shape or capacity, one of the best approaches is to understand, they carry backpacks with them every day and they're filled with books and they're filled with things and they're filled with all kinds of stuff. But the metaphoric backpack and the other things that they carry in them is a lot of weight. They carry the weight of these kinds of trauma that they're experiencing. They carry the weight of that into class every single day. So when a student walks into a classroom, a student walks into a program, a student walks in to get help, it's important for us to understand that they're not just bringing that one issue that they're coming in to talk about, they're bringing in a lot of other experiences, other issues, and other things. So that holistic approach to how we work with them and understanding the kinds of trauma that they're dealing with on top of a sexual abuse or a sexual assault is really vital and important. If I could also give y'all a good resource for understanding how to positively affect youth, I highly encourage you to look at the Search Institute. They have amazing resources. And if you've never heard of the 40 developmental assets, these are things that have been identified that students need, that young people need in order to be successful in life and to thrive. So I'm a huge fan of it. And I used a lot of that when I was doing community work in San Antonio and built programs around the assets. So that's a really good, those are a really good list of protective factors to kind of deal with all the risk factors that students are facing. Okay, go ahead. Okay, so you guys can, how do we want to do this? Y'all, let's ask this question, and then you can either put it in the
chat.
chat.
Should we chat in? Yeah, because there's so many people. We'll just do chat in.
Okay, so since COVID-19 has begun, what trauma experiences are you hearing about from your emerging adult clients?
Oh, death in the family. Yeah. I think that's, yeah, okay. Isolation, absolutely. Yeah. Emotional abuse. So that's interesting to me in terms of the context of COVID. Is that happening kind of over the phone or over text, over social media? Is that happening kind of, you know, more increases in emotional abuse and intimate partner relationships? Oh, absolutely, with economic abuse and economic struggles. I mean, we know that there's been significant job loss. People are really struggling to get by. Increases in domestic violence, physical. Okay, y'all are not struggling to come. These are going by quicker than I can read them. Yes. So being stuck at home with an abusive partner, an abusive family member, getting triggered from the kind of the context of COVID and really more people disclosing sexual abuse. Yes, absolutely. Financial needs, seeing a lot on financial needs.
Yeah, and I think it's important too that for us to understand, I know the question is really about emerging adult clients, but just be mindful of the fact that, you know, if we're seeing that in emerging adult clients in that age group, imagine what parents or adult influencers or the elders in their life are dealing with as well, right? So not only are they dealing with their own issues, but they're having to deal with a parent or a guardian or someone else that they live with, a partner, a spouse who is also dealing with these things as well.
And I think, you know, just seeing that there's a lot of mental health and economic instability coming up in the chat, that puts a strain on our service systems because we've got people with a lot of mental health needs. And I've been hearing from folks about, you know, counseling capacity at agencies being met, you know, wait lists to see clients. There's not enough counselors to go around. So really, you know, all of these increases and the lack of resources puts a strain on this workforce. And I think that's just really important to keep in mind as we're talking about how we engage with college campuses. Because, you know, we were doing some interviews recently and one of our participants said, you know, I would love to do more work on college campuses, but how can I, in good faith, do outreach to get more clients that we don't have capacity to see? So let's talk a little bit about the context of college campuses. If we can go to the next, and really I want to focus first on talking about emerging adults. So Rick really laid the groundwork for talking about adverse childhood experiences and adolescence. So what we know is that many of our survivors on the college campus, in the college campus context, whether we're talking about a community college, whether we're talking about a four-year school, or whether we're talking about trade schools, cosmetology school, and even graduate school, are folks that are typically the most at risk for sexual assault and intimate partner violence are people who already have adverse childhood experiences and have prior victimization experiences, or have other life adversities. So we see a lot of repeated victimization. The emerging adult period, similar to adolescence, is a really important time for intervention and prevention strategies. With our folks that have already experienced victimization or with our first-time emerging adult survivors, there's a lot of opportunity to work with those folks. And it's a really tender and important time because the impacts can really have lifelong ripples, just like adverse childhood experiences, that impact not only that immediate health and wellness, but long-term health and wellness and economic stability. So we see typically with sexual assault and intimate partner violence or dating violence survivors in the emerging adult categories, we're going to see increases in substance misuse. We're going to see increases in things like eating disorders or disordered eating behaviors. Of course, we're going to see some safety concerns, isolation, injury, economic hardship, and then we're also going to see a lot of academic disengagement and academic performance issues. Similar to what we see with our teen dating violence survivors, one of the kind of the canary in the coal mine for dating violence and sexual assault impact is going to be academics. We do have some survivors that are going to be, academics will be their safe space. It will be where they are still doing a lot of high performance. But for many survivors, we see that kind of immediate academic impact. And then we see kind of disrupted social networks. So part of the reason why this is such a critical intervention point is because we have them engaged in the campus system where we have some possibilities for help seeking and service engagement. And we also have all of these really critical life goals around academics and economics colliding. Emerging adulthood along with adolescence is also a time when we see onset for some different mental health experiences. So it's a really critical intervention point. And we know that these types of violence are very impactful in this age group. So if we go to the next slide. So things have changed a lot in the last 10 years. We have a pretty exponential increase in college campuses providing support to survivors. And whereas previously we might have had a response from campus law enforcement or maybe from the Title IX office that was probably understaffed, more and more colleges and universities of all sizes are implementing different services to support survivors, whether it's counseling or advocacy. Students are still most likely going to report sexual assault and intimate partner violence to a friend or a family member. Those are going to be the most common disclosure points. That is true actually across age demographics, but it's especially heightened in this group. So we find that, working not only, so when we think about working on college campuses, we're thinking about survivors and working with survivors, but we're also thinking about working with their social networks, because we know those social, like if Rick and I are back in college together and something happens to Rick, he's going to probably tell me before he tells his professor or before he tells a college. So my response to him becomes critical, because what we know from the research is that if I'm judgmental, if I'm not supportive, if I question his actions, that's going to have really negative mental health impacts for him. And it may cause him to not reach out for help again. But if I'm supportive, or even if I'm neutral, right, that will encourage him in a different way. What we found also is that when survivors disclose to their friends about things that have happened to them, if that friend knows about college services, they are more likely to access those. So the warm referral is even more impactful when it comes from a peer. So a couple of things to just keep in mind, and we'll talk about this later with kind of different potential intervention points, is that we talk about kind of universal risk in the emerging adult phase, but there are some groups that we know are at much heightened risk for sexual assault, dating violence, sexual harassment, and stalking. And that is the broad category of undergraduate women, undergraduate females. And if you dig into that specifically, especially women who identify as bi are going to be at the most heightened risk for some of these different types of sexual assault and intimate partner violence. Broadly, students who identify as Latinx or as or in the BIPOC family are going to have increased risk, especially for increased severity of violence. International students have a whole host of higher risk. And then broadly, people across the LGBTQ rainbow are going to have that actually should be at the top of the list rather than the bottom, but it's at the bottom there just to say that the risk is skyrocket. It is 2-3 times fold, depending on which study you're looking at. So when you think about targets for intervention, or when you think about risks, that is a critical group to look at in terms of their risk relative to other populations. Okay, next slide.
Insane.
Huh?
Yeah. I don't know. That is so weird. Okay. I
Okay,
know
great
some
question.
others are having that.
Wait. Are we okay? Okay. There's a great question. For the LGBT group, is it same-sex violence? Some of it is, some of it isn't. So we have increased, so when we're talking about things like acquaintance sexual assault or sexual harassment, it's not going to be typically same-sex violence. You know, one of the things that we see in the literature is that women who identify as bisexual or pansexual have the highest risk. I mean, both BIPOC and bisexual. Thank you for, yes. So the two highest risk groups are going to be people who identify as BIPOC and women who identify as bisexual. And we, for trans students, I see the note here about trans students. One thing where we do a really bad job in research is when it's a relatively small group and statisticians can't include them in their analysis. So what we know about trans students is more limited because, frankly, our scientists haven't done as good of a job studying that population and working with them in a community-driven way. But every piece of evidence that we have basically points to that trans folks are at incredibly heightened risk for both intimate partner violence and sexual assault, but really intense risk for sexual harassment and stalking too. And I know that's not the focus of what we're talking about today, but I kind of can't talk about that group without talking about their risk for harassment and stalking. Okay, I'm loving all the chat and the chatter. Okay, so all that to say is that everybody's at risk, but some folks have heightened risk that is really important to indicate. So when we talk about the institutional service response, we see institutions doing that in several different ways. And if we can go to the next slide, I'm just going to talk about some of the most typical services. And this is not an all-inclusive list, so I don't pretend to have everything on here, but typically we see services that are victimization specific and services that are adjacent but important to survivors. So let me start with victimization specific. There's advocacy, which is going to be the focus of what we talk about today. Typically, colleges are offering some kind of counseling to survivors or some kind of referral to counseling to survivors. And the extent of that service will vary a lot, but it's typically offered. We have the law enforcement response to sexual assault and intimate partner violence, and then all colleges and universities, and further all schools, period, have obligations under Title IX to create a safe learning environment. So those are kind of the typical entities where somebody who's experienced victimization may interface. Now, there's a couple of other places that are really important related to victimization that I want to mention. And the first is the University Health Service. So for a lot of survivors, where they're going to get introduced to either advocacy or counseling services is going to be through University Health Services. So we hear this on our study, and with all the work that we're doing on college campuses time and again, is that you'll have a survivor who perhaps thinks they're having a heart attack because they're having a panic attack because of an assault, and they're going to come to the University Health Service. Or you have a survivor who is engaging in heavy drinking because of trauma symptoms and has some health problems related to that, and they're going to come to health services. And then, of course, the one that we hear about the most is somebody who needs a gynecological exam and goes through health services for that. So the University Health Services are typically the highest referral point to either advocacy or counseling. We also see a lot of colleges increasingly working with disability services, student disability services, however it's called at that university, to work with survivors on academic accommodations. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. We also have the financial aid office, especially for dating violence survivors, but also for sexual assault survivors, when folks either have economic abuse from their intimate partner, or they're experiencing, they need to drop out of school and they maybe lose their aid, or they're on aid probation. The financial aid office becomes really important to the response. Our second kind of most frequently used referral source are going to be culturally specific programs, and I use that in kind of a broad term. Traditionally, one of the best partners for sexual assault and partner violence response work on college campuses has been either the LGBTQ Student Center or the Women's Center is what they use. Some universities still call it that. So those are going to be one of the most frequent places where we're going to see a lot of collaboration and referral. But we're also seeing increasingly Black student unions, fraternities and sororities, international student groups, you name it, but different culturally specific campus programs partnering with violence prevention and intervention services on campus. Those become really critical lifelines to students, and those partnerships are really important. And then, of course, we have student life or student services. I'll give you an example that on the UT Austin campus, the student emergency services, which are basically kind of the social service entity for UT Austin students. You've had a robbery, or you need emergency food help, or you need rent assistance, or, you know, those kinds of services. They partner really strongly with their advocacy shop to get survivors of violence assistance. Okay, so going to the next slide. So today we're going to focus on advocacy. And what we wanted to do before we kind of dig into campus-based advocacy is we want to kind of set the stage for advocacy. Now, I know because many of you chatted in with your titles and where you're at, that none of this is going to be new to you. So we won't spend a ton of time on this, but I just want to kind of frame what we're talking about when we talk about advocacy. This is going to be what some folks refer to as case management, and maybe in your organization it's called that. But when we're talking about advocacy, we're talking about when we're talking about campus advocacy, we're talking about something that really was developed from community-based models that have been implemented since the 60s to work with survivors of violence and really come from our grassroots empowerment-based traditions. In their modern form, what they look like is really the provision of information and referrals, safety planning. They're survivor-centered, they're trauma-informed, and they're really about increasing resources and social support. One of the key features of advocacy is the relationship between the advocate and the survivor. And there is, we sometimes refer to this as the alliance between the advocate and the survivor. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to like each other so much that you would go have a beer or coffee together. It's basically about trust, mutuality, and choice. So we're really looking at, very much like we talk about the good enough parent, I want you to think about this as the good enough advocate. Are they generally building a trustful alliance? Are they generally available within boundaried reason? And are they offering survivor choice? Those are some of the kind of hallmarks that we look at. I'll just say across several of our studies, we test this question of what's more important, time with your advocate or connection with your advocate. And connections had, across 2 different studies now, we see that what predicts having needs met is the feelings of connection with your advocate rather than how much time you spent together. So just take that into consideration. You don't have to move in together to get it done. Okay, next slide, please. So our community-based advocacy strategies are survivor-centered. So the survivor leads the interaction based on their needs and goals. We are meeting them where they're at physically, emotionally, spiritually, in their process of, especially when we're talking about an intimate partner wanting to stay or go in that relationship. It's trauma-informed. And here we have some of the trauma-informed principles that we're going to talk about in detail. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this right now, but just that, we are offering services from a trauma-informed perspective. And then critically, these services are voluntary. And this becomes really important when we're talking about campus-based advocacy, where we have Title IX mandated reporting provisions to consider. Those mandated reporting provisions really butt up against our movement goals and policy to provide services on a voluntary basis. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit when we talk about policy, but I just want to acknowledge that inherent tension between them. So when we think about community-based advocacy, we're really thinking about a service that you are actively engaging in, that you are not mandated to participate in, and that we maybe are inviting folks to participate into advocacy services, but it's not a condition of other services that they receive. Okay, next slide. And in that community-based approach, we're using that survivor-centered trauma-informed lens to establish a safe base for support. And that's part of what builds that alliance, that connection, that trust. We're facilitating access and connection not only to the services within the organization or the services within the college campus, but to other parts of the community. And that we're collaborating with survivors and that we're collaborating for survivors. If we go to the next slide, please. And we know that these approaches work. So we have a body of research that really promotes advocacy as a good strategy for addressing the impacts of sexual assault and intimate partner violence. I just wanted to note as we go to the next slide that advocacy, so when we're working for and with survivors and we're collaborating with them, it is both micro and macro. So we are working with individual clients on their individual goals and resource needs, but advocates, and this is what makes it a little bit different. And there's, I know this is all semantics, but this is just kind of part of the way that I describe it is how we might think about this a little bit differently than case management is advocacy means that not only are we working with individual clients to advocate for their needs in any specific setting, but it also means that we are advocating in the community for client needs, for survivors in general. So it's personal, it's political, in that we are working across different structures and communities. So this is when you have your advocate on the local SART team. That is macro advocacy. When we're working to, get the VOCA fix passed. I mean, let's just, oh my gosh, that was incredible last week. That came from advocacy. So really thinking about advocacy being not only a micro intervention, but a macro intervention, and that we work across different systems. And this becomes really a critical part of how we implement these services on a college campus. So thinking about that as we go to the next slide, what are some of the ways in your work that you do macro level advocacy? So whether it's collaborating with different community members, serving on a board, working on a different committee, doing political advocacy, providing research and evaluation guidance, are there different activities, working on a SART or a coordinated community response? What different macro advocacy strategies do you use in your work?
That's a really great question, Nicole. For those of you all that may not see it, Nicole is asking of all the different offices on campus, is the recommendation that advocate work on SART as the primary contact versus the Title IX or the University Police Department offices?
Great question. I would have to know more about the context of that, but my instinct, and Rick, I'd be curious for you to chime in here, is that an advocate should be on the SART as a that would be really critical from my perspective.
Yeah, and hey, Nicole, I know Nicole. And so it's a great question, Nicole, and it makes a lot of sense, but it also, this is just me coming from an advocacy perspective, that the advocacy team should be the one who kind of spearheads and leads that SART as well. specifically since it's a response team and, you know, it's a holistic approach and it involves a whole bunch of different departments and other people who have various roles in a case or when a report is made. So rather than having a Title IX office, if I'm understanding correctly, rather than having a Title IX office kind of lead or the PD lead the SART, it should come from an advocacy perspective. And then having the Title IX folks and UPD sit on that SART, because it makes everyone better and more accountable.
So I'm seeing in the chat that folks are part of their SART, they're working on different coalitions. I see an intersection with human trafficking coalition work, which is awesome. Working on interdisciplinary teams, absolutely. So especially for those of us that might interface in medical settings, like Dixie and I work at a medical campus. If you're doing work, you know, triaging at the end of the day with, you know, different entities like doctors and nurses, and you're educating them about sexual assault, that is macro advocacy. I see someone has their hand raised. Go ahead and unmute or chat in.
Elisa, you can unmute.
Hi, I'm Elisa from the University of Texas at El Paso. And on a macro advocacy strategy, what we've taken is to provide a conference for that do not have a advocacy program like we do. We have a department dedicated to that. We have 2 advocates and a trauma-informed therapist, and then we have our outreach team as well. So we put together a conference every year so that, you know, we can reach out to different college campuses that don't have that, and we kind of strategize with that. So that's kind of what we're doing over here in El Paso.
I love that strategy. I saw the notice for your conference, and, you know, feel free to drop it in the chat. I think it is awesome that you all are doing it, and that is a great example of macro advocacy.
Yes, and for those of y'all, Elisa, please do put a link to the conference in the chat so that folks can hear about it. But it's happening August 11th through 13th, and I have to say this is the second time they're doing it, and it is it's an amazing conference. They do a really good job of incorporating a lot of advocacy perspectives.
Okay, as a social worker, I love this one. So I'm a social worker by trade. Conducting a training at the hospital here for social work team about sexual assault. Yes. So all this to say that when we get to the college campus, those same principles apply, that not only are we working one-on-one with clients or doing groups with clients, is that we are part of committees, coalition, training, holding events that educate the community and connect the community. We're working on creating trauma-informed environments for survivors and their peer support networks. And that becomes really critical in the college campus environment, where peer influence and the context of the college community is really central. Because colleges are kind of like small towns. I don't know if anybody here is practicing or working in a small town, but they're like little small towns. And that's part of how we kind of implement this work. So if we go to the next slide. So when we're bridging the campus and the community together, there's several different strategies, and we can just go ahead and go to the next slide. That's just a picture of a bridge at my alma mater. There's several different ways. Again, this is not an all-inclusive list, but I just kind of want to share. These are things that, you know, when we talked about this presentation, that we typically see as campus community collaboration models. We often will see, you know, that a college campus has their own either Title IX advocacy or counseling services. Like UTEP is a great example of that. They have a dedicated advocacy shop. So does UTRGV. So those are examples of places that have a standalone center that may be located within another center, but they have standalone services. Or you'll see a lot of collaboration with the community-based program, and that can look at a lot of different ways. Sometimes we have co-located services. So you either have a campus advocate who's working at the community sexual assault program, or you have a community sexual assault program who offices or virtually offices on the college campus. So that's one of a common model of collaboration we see. We also see that happening through planning and guidance commissions or committees. So that's SARTs, campus sexual response teams, community coordinated response, high risk teams. That's another place where you might have both the college campus and the community folks together. Title IX teams is a Title IX committee is one of the most common ways we see that happen. Colleague collaboration, definitely, with this research project, we've been collaborating with 5 UT system campuses. And so we do a lot of collaboration together on this particular study. There are models of, especially for counseling, community organizations providing counseling sessions to survivors on collegiate campuses. And then Rick, do you want to add anything else about different campus and community RCC collaboration models you see?
Yeah, I think, so if there are, I actually am going to add this. If there are any colleges, universities on this webinar, this training right now, one of your best allies and an asset to how you respond to survivors who are making reports or seeking services on campus is to ensure that your local program is at the table. Make sure that they have a seat in some way, shape, or form. Build those connections, reach out to them, because you both can learn from each other, right? Because if students are not accessing services on campus, chances are, hopefully, they are going off campus to go to a sexual assault program and getting the help that they need. And someone just put in the chat box, what do I mean by local program? That means that if you are a college or university in a city or town or a county, reach out to the folks that your local rape crisis center, your local sexual assault program, your local dual agency that does domestic violence work as well. Reach out to them, meet with them. That at the center of this diagram here is campus community collaboration, right? That's the term of it. And it's so important to have those folks at the table. I work a lot with Our Lady of the Lake University here in San Antonio, and it's a give and take as far as us with coalition work and providing them with technical assistance. And then they also do work with local rape crisis center, right? So there's a lot of that happening, but I think if you're not doing it already, you should have your local community programs at the table.
Okay, over to you, Rick.
So to kind of piggyback off of what Leila was talking about in terms of these community collaborations and understanding, what kind of services and programs you should be providing for survivors on campus, it really is important to kind of look at and understand, what a trauma-informed service or a trauma-informed program is, right? And so here's just some things to consider. If you aren't already doing this, or if you have a program and trying to look for a direction to go or want to be more survivor-centered, a program that is trauma-informed is informed about and really sensitive to trauma that's related to related issues that present in students or survivors, right? It's in understanding, again, looking at those adverse childhood experiences, understanding where someone is coming from, understanding historical trauma, understanding cultural relevancy and cultural competency, all of those things and how that plays into the issues that a student or survivor is presenting now. All of the components of trauma-informed services or programs are reconsidered in light of basic understanding of the role that violence plays in the lives of our students and survivors, and understanding and validating those things, as I said earlier, letting survivors know that their reactions or what happened to them or what they've experienced is a normal response to something tragic or something abnormal that happened to them. And it also integrates an understanding of a student's or a survivor's history and the entire context of their experience. It's also systems focused, right? It's not so insular that we are the only folks that are working with this. It's also taking what you do with survivors on that micro level, and as Leila said, applying it macro, involving every other system that is going to touch a survivor or be involved in a survivor's experience or in the way that they're seeking help. And then a trauma-informed program also understands the interconnectedness and the interdependence and intersectionality. Okay, go to the next slide. So this is a really good helpful tool for me as well, just in doing some reading. But it's from Helping Traumatized Children Learn, Creating and Advocating for Trauma-Sensitive Schools. And basically, a trauma-sensitive school is one in which all students feel safe, they feel welcomed, they feel supported. And it's one where addressing trauma's impact on learning on a school-wide basis is really at the center of its educational mission. An ongoing inquiry-based process, it allows for the necessary teamwork, coordination, creativity, and sharing of responsibility for all students. And at the core, it's really just understanding that this is not just a counseling department issue. This is not just a victim advocacy issue. This is not just a Title IX issue, right? It's understanding that every single person plays a role in when understanding and addressing trauma, every person involved on campus plays a role in how that student feels supported, in how that student feels welcomed, in how they feel safe. Because if it's happening to one, it has happened or will happen to others. And so how we work with that one student or how that one student feels is going to resonate on the entire campus, especially how they feel about their experience. And so we don't want to isolate them and just, move them over to the place where we think is the best way for them to get help. That's great. But if you do it in a way that you understand their trauma and are not making decisions for them, but are making referrals and giving out information to students that's, again, in a way that is holistic and understanding that everyone has that role, it makes it easier for students to want to get help and to seek services other than just this place, right? And it doesn't keep it so isolated and insular. Okay, go ahead. So a program or an organization or a system, and we know that education or higher education institutions are systems. Those that are trauma informed, they realize the widespread impact of trauma and they understand potential paths for recovery. And this, again, should be touched on every aspect of a student's life or a survivor's life. And if we're talking specifically about a college campus, it's from where they live to where they play, to where they dine, to where they learn, and to where they go to escape or where they go recreationally. All of those things, they recognize that there's trauma there and everyone plays a role in providing that path to recovery. A program or an organization or a system that's trauma-informed also recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in their clients, also in their families, in their staff, and others that are involved within the system. And it also responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies and procedures and practices, and also seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. And that is the hardest part. And I think the next few slides, we're going to talk about institutional betrayal. Leila is going to kind of drive that point home about what it means to actively resist re-traumatizing a survivor, because it's very simple to do. And we don't even know that we're doing it sometimes, right? But survivors will feel it. And so our job is to recognize and be very mindful of the position that we're putting survivors in, and are we actively letting them know and engaging them in the whole process and being transparent and open as possibly as we can. So next slide. So Leila kind of talked a little bit about the principles of trauma-informed care in this is specific to university campuses or implementation. And we're going to talk about those later too, but the principles of trauma-informed care is safety, trustworthiness, choice and control, collaboration, empowerment, and cultural competence, right? Done from both a student and a faculty and staff perspective. And so when you're thinking about doing or creating a program that's trauma-informed, you have to not just think about it from a student perspective. You also have to think about faculty and staff, because how is this going to affect them? Are they potentially going to need services? Are they going through the exact same thing that a student is going through? Are they experiencing violence at home? Are they experiencing violence at work? Are they experiencing violence in the classroom, right? So not just students, but faculty and staff as well. So there has to be this approach that addresses both, not just one. And when we think about it, there are a lot of good outcomes when we use trauma-informed practices. So staff is more engaged and they're excited about making these kinds of changes. They ask for more training about understanding trauma, and we've seen that happen with some of the schools that I've worked with, mostly here in San Antonio, is they want to understand what that is. Trauma-related language is used more frequently when we're talking about these kinds of issues, or we're talking about it in staff meetings or during supervision. And staff is really better able to recognize that the people they serve experience trauma, and that they're reacting in the present based on those past experiences. So again, thinking about what happened to them in the past and how that is affecting how they present to you right now. It also it produces changes in attitude among staff, and it's developing this understanding of trauma and what it means to survivors and how it impacts them. And then, the other thing that we've kind of seen is that staff respond differently to survivors based on how much they understand what trauma is. They react and respond differently to survivors when they know what trauma is. They're a little bit more flexible, a little bit more patient, a little bit more non-judgmental, and understanding that accommodations are needed. And it's not just left to, again, the counseling department or Title IX or anyone who's providing interim measures or responsible for those kinds of things. This is a holistic approach, and everyone who works on a college campus understands. Next slide.
And I think, spoiler alert, we think of campus-based advocacy as a way to make a college campus more trauma-informed. And really thinking about one of the reasons that is so critically important is because of this concept of institutional betrayal. So in case you haven't, encountered this before, institutional betrayal is what occurs when an institution causes harm to an individual who trusts that institution. So this may happen in a workplace. It may happen, the military is a great example of this. Anybody who's part of, if there's violence within a corporation or an affiliation, institutional betrayal is something that survivors can experience when the institution they're affiliated with. For example, I am a graduate of Indiana University, Bloomington. I love my institution, right? But they have really let survivors down in the past. So, and probably in the present and future. So we're talking about a situation where a student is engaged, they're a proud UTEP student, they're a proud University of Houston student, and they do not get what they need either through omission or commission, actively or more passively, when it comes to preventing or deterring violence or supporting students. Institutional betrayal is both pragmatic, it's the loss of being able to attend school, it's the loss of resources, it's injury, and it's psychological, including emotional distress. One thing that we see with institutional betrayal is DARVO, which is deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. And I'm going to put some things in the chat. But DARVO is basically what an institution will do when they either deny there's a problem, when they attack a survivor, and when they reverse the victim and offender. So rather than the victim who had the sexual assault experience being the victim is the institution. The opposite of this is institutional courage, when an institution really shows up and is accountable for their behaviors and actions. So what we're going to do now is, so I just want to I'm going to provide some resources about institutional betrayal and institutional courage in the chat. We don't have time for our chat-in moment right now, so we're going to move on to the next slide, but I'm going to provide some information. We'll revisit institutional courage when we talk about the toolkit in a little bit. So Dixie, take it away.
Hi, yeah, so part of this I'm gonna run through a bit, but if you have any questions, feel free to chat them in and we can address them, or I'll have my contact information at the end. So with all the work that we've done, we created the campus-based advocacy evaluation toolkit. And the first round, which came out in the fall of last year is based on interviews, focus groups, and surveys of both advocates on campus and survivors seeking services. So we have since then engaged in a longitudinal survey with about over 100 survivors that have sought services on campus. And we surveyed them at right after they use services, 3 months, 6 months, and then a year. And that will wrap up in later in August, and then we'll be coming out with the Toolkit 2.0 with updates from what we found out from the longitudinal survey. So just quickly, this is all things that you all know, but when we asked students and advocates what their highest needs were, the most common response were between two things. One was information about law enforcement, which included campus and community-based law enforcement and academic accommodations. So those two things were the top of mind for survivors when they were seeking services. And then that was followed by information on help getting safe. So really it's a continuation of the two things that we've been talking about, that students and survivors need most after experiencing violence, which is connection to formal and informal support and safety planning information. So Leila talked a lot about community-based advocacy, and I'm going to quickly go through some ways that advocacy is adapted. The community-based advocacy model is adapted for a campus-based approach. And this is all based on the data collection that we've done, hearing from survivors, hearing from advocates. So the first thing that we look at that's a little bit different on campus-based advocacy is looking at both the emerging adult population and understanding the ways that it can be, we need to look at their academics and the idea that they are a student. So generally, campus-based advocacy is a very student-centered advocacy model. So again, these are all things that we've been talking about. Services are voluntary, they're collaborative, they're based on referring to resources and students determining their own needs and goals. So going to the next slide, the other thing that we found out is how campus-based advocacy is modeled around trauma-informed care. So again, these are all things that we have been talking about with community-based advocacy. All of these things translate into being on, moving from a community-based model to a campus-based model. So the adaptation, number one, as I said, is understanding that the majority, while not all of survivors on campuses, the majority are going to come from the emerging adult developmental phase. And like I said at the beginning, that's the age group of about 18 to 25. So what you're going to see here is there's going to be a lot of psychoeducation that's needed with this group. Maybe or maybe not more than you would need for an adult population past the age of 25. Emerging adults are at a very pivotal age for life skill development. So there may be a range in the life skills or the ability to seek help that you see among these survivors that are emerging adults. And then this is one really interesting quote from an advocate that we highlight. And it's this, you know, after an experience of sexual assault, this may be the first pelvic exam, the first pap smear that an individual has experienced in their life. So part of your advocacy might be going step by step, this is what's going to happen, and then this, and then this, and then this, that maybe for someone who's a bit older that has gone through that may know. So the second adaptation is understanding the university community experience. So as Leila said, universities and campuses are typically little towns, cities within their own. So understanding that there's going to be a close proximity of peers. There needs to be adaptations when you're talking about safety planning. These are all things that you all know, especially if you work on a campus. But within safety planning, and we're going to talk a lot about this in the part 2 of this section, is focusing on academic and social goals, and connecting to both informal and formal resources on campus. Like I said, I'm just kind of really moving through these because I want to get to talk with as much time as possible for some of the evidence we have found for discrimination and bias. So we've talked a lot about the role of institutional and institutional policy. We're going to talk a bit about that later on. But this is really understanding both the
See, let's save the stuff on.
You're good, Dixie. Go ahead.
So I think this is what Leila said to move through. So I'm going to just skip to microaggressions. This is something that I really wanted to talk about in this section.
Okay.
So microaggressions, there's 2 types of information on this slide. So one is under this basic understanding of how microaggressions work, who experiences them, and how they interact with, as you know, microaggressions in and of themselves are an experience of trauma or cause trauma. And then on this other end, someone that has experienced violence and then experiences a microaggression, either when they're trying to seek services or when they disclose, or maybe even during and with their experience of trauma, that trauma experience is really going to be compounded. And as advocates, we need to understand how those 2 things interact with each other. So 2 things that we have found in our data is one, the experience of microaggressions both prevents full engagement in services. So let's say you go to seek out service and experience a microaggression in that transaction with an advocate. You're much less likely to return to services there, to fully engage in everything that office or program may offer. And then the second thing is that microaggressions, or the experience of microaggressions, may prevent individuals from seeking services in the first place. So if you've had a previous interaction with a system on campus and it involved a microaggression, it involved some sort of trauma or something like that, you're most likely not going to seek services at all in the future. So then on the other half of this slide, you can see that there are some examples of what a microaggression could look like in the experience in the systems, in the programs on campuses. And obviously this is not an exhaustive list, but it just will give you some things to think about when you are trying to create a welcoming, accessible program on your campus. So what we have found in the literature, in previous studies, and also in our studies, is that individuals that, in fact, the high-risk individuals that Leila talked about earlier, so individuals from Black, Indigenous, people of color populations, LGBTQIA+ populations, Latinx students, are all more likely to experience violence, but less likely to report their experience of violence or seek help after that. So what we do is we look at these experiences through an ecological framework, and it's very kind of theory oriented, a little bit academic, but basically what that does, what that theory says is you're understanding that an individual is coming to you in a complex context with that individual has both interacted with different systems, and those systems in their life interact, such as, you know, their families and how they interact with their peers, their environment, and then the socio-political climate. The other thing that I would add to this is how is the pandemic. So that is another context that everyone, I'm sure, is seeing now that's interplaying in this, the ecology of an individual and the systems they interact with. So specifically what we have found from our data, I'm not going to read through all these quotes. I know this is a lot of text on one slide, but we found several different things. So one, we heard that students say, or survivors say, my advocate was white, but she addressed it. She talked about it. It made me feel comfortable to be able to talk about those things in the process of our advocacy relationship. So addressing it outright, looking at it, talking about it as an advocate is one thing that we heard students really appreciated, survivors really appreciated. The other thing is when you don't quite make the mark, when you misstep. So this first quote is an instance where a survivor felt unseen or unheard, and it actually was never addressed later on in their relationship with this advocate. So it really impacted their ability to trust that advocate, to want to go back to services. So the things that we understand that we're seeing from the data is, while we all are going to make missteps, while we can't be completely culturally competent in every situation, we can certainly be culturally sensitive. We can come to it with humility and understand that we're going to make mistakes, and it's better for survivors if we come out up front and say that and talk through it as advocates. As for myself, as a person, as a white person with other elements of privilege, it's more important to talk about it directly. So this is thinking more broadly about institutional culture, and we just have a few minutes left. So I really want to get to some of these things here, but I know I'm going to be rushing through. So like I said,
I think we'll pick it up. We'll pick it up when we start back. There's no need to rush because we'll just add, this is like the meat of what we want to talk about. So we'll just start with session 2 about it. No need to rush.
Sounds good. So looking at cultural accommodations and cultural adaptations are two ways that an institution, we can really build in this idea of being accessible and open to different cultural identities, and as we look at how we do advocacy. So cultural accommodations, so there are modifications in the way practice is delivered that can be utilized with a particular community. I'm sure many of you already build this into your individual advocacy, but when we're thinking about an institution, how can we build in this idea of modifications in our systems, in our programs, that really make it more accessible, more open to individuals coming from lots of different communities. And then cultural adaptations. So again, changing or modifying the structure of a program to appropriately fit the needs and preferences of a particular cultural group or community. And I've included, and I can include some of the other article references as well. So looking at the survivor perceptions of campus-based advocacy, since we have 2 minutes left, is this a good place to stop, Leila? Rick, do you want to start off here?
Yeah, I think what we want to do, what we want to accomplish in this kind of in our last 2 minutes is really setting up that not only are they a way to have a more trauma-informed campus, and that kind of considerations related to social justice issues and microaggressions and macroaggressions and bias and oppression are critical to campus advocacy. But we also just want to say with this slide that survivors think very highly of these services and find them to be really effective. So part of the reason why we've spent a lot of time studying these services is to find out if they are indeed effective. And we'll have kind of our results for our longitudinal study later this fall, but really in some of our pilot work, we see that these services are really effective for diverse groups of survivors, especially when a university is able and a campus community is able to provide them in a trauma-informed way and is able to attend to issues of culture and oppression and discrimination and bias. So those are kind of the critical ingredients. And what we want to do in our second session is we're going to kind of revisit some of those adaptation points and policy points. And then we're going to really dig into what we identified in the toolkit as 7 core goals with skills attached to them of the campus advocacy logic model, and really dig in more to those specific skills. So how do we do these skills in a trauma-informed, social justice-oriented way? So that's what we're going to do. When we come back at, this is so sad, I don't know what time we come back at. At 1:30. 1:30. So we hope that you all join us again for, we're going to dig deep into these skills and activities, and we're going to have time for discussion. So is there anything else we want to say before we wrap up? This is kind of setting us up to get detail oriented in session 2. Okay, awesome. Thank you all for joining us. We're really excited to have such a good crowd today, and we hope to see you after lunch. I hope everybody gets a good lunch. I know I'm going to get nice coffee. And there's some information about where to find the toolkit if you can't meet us. If you can't come for session 2 and you want, it'll be archived on the website, and you can also reach out to any of us. There's our email.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great lunch, and we will see you later this afternoon, right after lunch. Take care, everyone.